In the last section, we successfully got our test running with an assertion. So right now, I feel like our test is definitely doing the right thing and testing the right behavior. But we were greeted with this nice big warning on here, something about a deprecation warning. It specifically says, Mongoose's default promise library is deprecated. Plug in your own promise library instead. So by default, when we use Mongoose, it has a default promise library plugged into it. As we've seen in the last section, whenever we do some operation with Mongoose that touches our database, it returns a promise. And that promise is fulfilled or rejected depending on whether or not the operation with the database was successful or failed. This built-in promise implementation, like the promise that gets returned from joe.save right here, is using this impromise thing that is plugged into Mongoose. Okay, so that's what that error message is saying. It is saying we have a default implementation of a promise library, but for whatever reason, we don't want you to use it. So instead, we have the option to plug in our own promise library. We can use a couple of very popular ones in the Node.js community, which are Bluebird, Q, or ES6 promises. In this course, we're going to be using ES6 promises because they're going to absolutely fulfill everything that we need for promises coming out of Mongoose. If all this stuff kind of seems like a little bit arbitrary, like, okay, why doesn't Mongoose just kind of figure this stuff out for us? Well, yeah, it kind of is. Mongoose does this to give us a lot more flexibility in what promise implementation we want to use, which for some users is really important. For some projects, that's something that you really care about. But definitely when you're first starting out, it's something that you don't really have to worry about too much. So all we have to do is fix up Mongoose's internal promise that it uses. Let's do that really quick. I'm going to again open up my test helper file. And at the very top of this file, after our require statement, I'm going to add in a new line in here. We're going to say mongoose.promise equals global.promise. So on the left-hand side, we are saying, hey Mongoose, whenever you want to create a promise for like any type of interaction with the database whatsoever, we want you to use this library, this implementation of the promise library. Global.promise is a reference to the ES6 implementation of promises inside the Node.js environment. So we're basically saying with this line right here, hey, whenever you need to create a promise, just use the ES6 implementation. All right, let's save this line and execute our test again and see if we got that message to go away. So our tests run, and okay, everything looks good. You will notice that we still have that good to go message in here. I think that we probably don't need that message anymore, so I'm just going to take it out and replace it with a set of curly braces instead. So once we open up our connection to Mongo, okay, no need to do anything just yet. So let's run this again. And okay, everything looks good in here. Now there is one issue around open that we kind of started to address but never really wrapped up. So I'm going to go back a couple diagrams. If you recall looking at this one right here, where we had said, okay, Mocha is going to start up, we'll tell Mongoose to connect to Mongo, and then at some point in time, Mongoose will successfully connect to Mongo, and at that point in time, we should run our tests or show an error to the user. Well, we're definitely showing an error to the user, and we were able to test that out. But the one thing that we never really did was we never really, at that point in time, told Mocha to run our tests. All of our tests are clearly working right now, but this is more about handling the case in which, well, maybe for whatever reason, it took longer than we expected to connect to Mongo, and maybe the test suite, Mocha, started to run our tests too soon. So to accommodate for that case, to make sure that we're always going to be in the clear 100% of the time and we're not just relying on Mongoose connecting to Mongo really quickly, we're going to wrap our connection statement with a before call. So we've already used before each before. This time around, we're going to use a slightly different hook. We're going to use one called before. This also will be called with a function that we write. The difference between before and before each is that before only is executed one time for all of your tests, your entire test suite. So for us, we only need to tell Mongoose to connect to Mongo exactly one time, right? Like we don't need to disconnect from Mongo between every single test. That would just add in some unnecessary pause. we only want to connect to Mongo one time, so we're going to use the before callback right here. So I'm going to take all of our connection logic, I'm going to move it up into the before call. All right, so that looks better. Now the last thing to keep in mind is that this connection to Mongoose is going to take some amount of time. So again, we want to say to Mocha, hey, just hold up for a second, pause execution, and wait until we have successfully connected to Mongo. So we are again going to reference our done callback, and then only once that we have successfully opened a connection to Mongo, we will call our done callback. So in other words, connect to Mongoose, wait however long it takes, and once that connection is open, inform Mocha that we're ready to go on to our first test. So let's now give this a little bit of a shot. I'll run npm run test again. And okay, looks much better. We're still connecting, all of our tests are still passing, but now we're guaranteed that in the case that maybe if Mongoose takes some long time to connect to, and who knows under what circumstances that might occur, we're going to not run any of our tests until our connection has been successfully made. Okay, so in this section, we both enhanced our Mongoose connection logic up here, and we also added in a default promise implementation for the Mongoose library. We're now at a pretty good spot where we have a single test written, and we've got a very solid setup for our Mocha test environment. So let's continue in the next section and start thinking about what other tests we might want to write around creating and saving records to our database.